Hi, I'm Patricia Allingham Carlson, and this is how I painted my watercolor unicorn. I've always enjoyed fantasy, reading fantasy, writing fantasy, painting fantasy. I've painted mermaids and dragons and castles, but I'd never done a unicorn before. So I decided to take on the challenge. I hope you enjoy it. Now let's paint. I began this painting looking at a photograph of a very beautiful horse's head. It was a black horse. I loved the pose, so I decided to try to do the horse's head, but make him into a unicorn. I tape up my paper, going from side to side and smoothing out as I go, and then I force down the tape very carefully with the brush. The next thing I do is go around the edges with some wax. Wax helps to contain all of the paint from spilling out onto the stretching surface. I drew the horse's head in, and then I came in with some masking fluid. To mask in the lightest areas. I was going for a sweeping drawing. Sweeping, wind fantasy blowing. The horse looking strong and gentle at the same time, and trying to make him look as magical as I possibly could. I wanted to mask in some pure white edges to make the painting look pure and beautiful and clean and very magical around a dark night full of magical spheres and orbs and sparkles. I looked at other artists' references to see how they did unicorn horns. There were many different styles of unicorn horns. I decided to go with a sort of a spiral shape that seemed to be what many artists thought a unicorn's horn might look like. But you really could make the horn any way you wanted. This was a lot of masking for all the little hairs as well. After the masking was dry and done, I came in with water all around the edges of the horse to do the background. When it was good and wet, I came in with my watercolors. My watercolor was as concentrated as I could make it. Here I'm using Quin Magenta. I'm using Permanent Rose. I'm using Viridian Green, Cobalt Blue. And as it starts to dry, I spray it down because I want it to flow and be very wet. I've mixed indigo in with some purple to make some good dark colors. And knowing that all these colors will dry much later, I continue to concentrate them and add more. Here I've mixed in some Payne's Gray as well. And then I go back and I do it again with more concentrated colors. You can see how the colors are not running off the paper. And that is because I had that line of wax going around the edge. When you're working this wet, colors want to run and water wants to run. Now I'm splatter painting some even darker splatters of color into the background. When I splatter, I use my hand to mask off where I don't want the paint to go. And that's on a very white horse. I'm painting in sort of an organic tree form in the background. I don't know if it will last through my next steps or not, but I did it anyway. Next, I sprinkled a little salt onto the surface to see if it will give me the salt crystalline type of effect. And there I go adding more paint, which I should not be doing after putting down the salt. But I usually can't help myself, and I did it anyway. Took a picture of that with my iPad, and then I let it dry. I begin to work into the horse. I'm putting down colors, and I'm actually using my finger to smear them around a little bit. If you're going to do this, make sure you wash your hands very carefully while you're working and afterwards, because some of the paints are toxic. I certainly don't eat anything while you're painting. Here I'm using blue and turquoise. I'm adding some basic shading and shadows to the horse, and he does have masking. Now I've taken some Payne's gray and some indigo and made him much darker in the shadowed areas. I wash my shadows out with a wet brush so they'll blend and flow. And I'm mixing in a little purple into my shadowed areas as well. I've decided to make my light source primarily on the top right. So I'm treating all the colors in that way. I finished one painting session and I'm coming back for the next one. At this point, I'm darkening some of my shadows and I'm starting to define where the hair will go on the face of the horse. I'm beginning to define where the eyes will be, remembering that they have masking on them as well still. I'm looking closely at my reference picture so I could see how the anatomy of the horse actually is. And now I begin to remove some of the masking so I can see what I'm doing. I'm outlining the basic edges of the eye. I'm filling in the hair around it and putting a shadow under that hair. And the shading colors that I'm using are pretty much what I've used in the background. I'm finding where the pupil should go in the eye by outlining with my brush. and then doing the same for the other eye. Now I begin to take off all the other masking. It's quite a mess. So here I'm cleaning up the edge of the horn against the background. I put down some color to smooth out the edges, and then I'll blend it in with a damp brush so it looks like it's a natural part of the background. I'm shading the whole lower section of the spirals of the unicorn's horn. I'm also figuring out how it should be blended into the head, partially covered with some hair, and where the base actually is attached to the structure of the animal's head. And just how to show that. Doing a little bit of paint removal on the sphere up top. And cleaning up around the other edges where some of the masking was removed. I'm also taking some paint out of the background in a sort of a streaming spiral type of feeling. I'm doing that by painting over the dry background with a damp brush and then blotting. And doing that repeatedly removes these white lines or these lighter colored lines in the background, just to suggest some spirals of magic. How do you paint magic? I don't know any more than anybody does. But I can guess and try different effects and see what looks good to me. So that's what I'm doing. Now I'm getting the eye pupil section a little darker on each side, and in the eyelid and lashy line that goes around the eyes. I'm working into the background and making it darker in some spots. I'm trying to paint around the little crystalline structures formed by the salt in the wet paint so I can retain that texture. There's a lot of small hairs for me to decide how they're going to go and be arranged on the animal's head. Where I think I don't want the hair, or it's too thick, or the masking didn't work right, I have to remediate and correct the line of the hair. I'm deepening the shading on the horse as well. And now I remove some more of the masking that was left on the lower part of the horse's face and on the edge. All these hard white edges that are left will have to be softened with a damp brush. The rest of the horse's mane and head hair are coming off now for the masking part. And I have a lot of work to do still. I'm adding some additional hairs by removing some paint. I put down some damp water and then I blot it. I'm giving a darker edge right along the horse's face to make the white stand out against the darkness. And the same thing along the horn. And I'm still trying to paint around the crystalline structure of the textured background so I can retain that magical sparkling effect that the salt left me with. I'm working on the area around the horse's mouth and nose. I'm softening my white edges and I'm adding a lot more shading. I've also outlined where the mouth should be, but I'm keeping that very subtle and subdued. I'm finding that the horse will need more shading at the bottom. And as you can see, I'm curving the lines as they go underneath the chin and underneath the muzzle because the horse curves there. I'm going to be adding more shading, I think, in the future because it doesn't look quite right to me. But at this point, it's a lot of small tweaks and a lot of small finishings. I really want to make the white mane on the right-hand side stand out more because it needs to be a strong part of the grace and beauty of this creature. And right now it's not standing out enough. But I'm going around the horse and softening the white edges left by the masking. And adding shading as I go. And in some cases taking shading away, which I just did by blotting. Here I saw that I had shaded the brow too much and the brow needed to stand out more. So I'm taking some paint off of that area and shading next to it. I'm also subduing the nostril on the left-hand side more. And I've decided to bring out a couple little white sparkles in the background. And I'm doing that by painting on water and then blotting repeatedly. And I like how that looks. In some areas, some paint lifts a lot easier than others. So where it won't lift, I'm just saying, okay, doesn't need a sparkle there. Well, I'm putting off that hair because it's such an important part of the beauty of the creature, and yet it's going to be very hard and take a lot of time. But when I do begin the hair, I start on the horse's forehead first. I'm finding where I want the hairs to be under, where I want them to overlap, which ones should be the most white highlight, and which ones can be darker. Some of them go clear across the horse's forehead into the background, so I'm trying to paint them on top by making them be all white. And then I'm cleaning up the edges of the ones underneath. I'm also making the mane thicker by taking some paint out in a couple of places. And then I have a thicker lock of hair. I took a little paint off the left side of that ear so that it would have some reflected light. And I thought that would add some interest as well. And turning to that hair on the right side, the hair of the horse's mane. I'm beginning to paint some darks within to make the white, light colored hair stand out. I'm painting between the strands, and I'm painting some clumps in by making it darker around the medium tone sections. I'm painting shadows underneath all of the hairs I want to stand out on the horse. And I'm continuing to darken the background in some areas. I've decided to work some more on the horse's nose and mouth area because it still doesn't look quite right. I'm adding some more shading on the lower areas, and I'm softening the nostril around the edges with water. A little bit of color and then a little bit more. And I'm using primarily Payne's Gray at this point with the shading and shadowing section here. I'm going much darker around the base of the unicorn's horn. And then shading along the edges of the bottoms of the individual hairs on the horse's brow. Smoothing out the rough edges and softening them as well in the mane. So the hair looks like it's floating on a magic wind, which sounds funny, but it's sort of how I look at it. Decided that that one section of dark I painted in looked weird, so I decided to remove it and blot it out. And so I continue to tweak the hair, tweak the nose, tweak the shading. Here I'm making the shading on the nose much darker and softening it as it moves up with a damp brush. I think that the hair on that horse's mane took longer than anything else altogether. And looking at it, I wanted it to stand out more against the background. So I'm adding some darker colors all around the individual strands and clumps of hair. And that is giving me the effect of what I want for contrast. It's just taking such a long time. At this point, I begin to ask myself, is this horse done indeed? Is my unicorn saying what he needs to be saying? I evaluate again to see that all the hair is properly softened and make some sense as to where it's going. I'm doing final tweaks, adding a little bit of dark, adding a little bit of pink into the mane as well to pick up on the pink on the left side of the horse's background. It's always good to repeat a color into more than one area, and so I do that. and I'm signing it, and it's done. I hope you enjoyed watching how I painted unicorn. I hope you'll give it a thumbs up and subscribe. If you ring the bell below on the link, you can end up getting notices to all of my future videos, and then you won't miss one. There's also some links below to click on to see my art page on Facebook, my blog about art and life, and some products that I use when I create my art. Additionally, I have my own art products page for purchase. I enjoy your comments, so please feel free to comment. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next video.